Ahoy hoy, and welcome back to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and I am just happy to be here and happy to have another great interview in which I learned an incredible amount that I did not know before, because I think I've mentioned several times on the show, I'm not like a rivet head. I'm definitely one of those people that focuses on the people, so when I do actually learn things about the ship, it's always a fascinating moment for me. So sit back, relax, enjoy.
Simply because, as you can see, I climb around in my chair like a child, and I clear my throat, and I bang teacups, and it's horrible. I'm going to edit out this because it's dumb. But anyway, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. If you could do me a big favor and introduce yourself for the two listeners that I have.
Hi everyone, my name's Mark Chirnside. I'm a maritime historian, and I've got a history degree now, so I'm entitled to say that. And my focus, it started with Titanic, but I've
Mm-hmm.
broadened out really. So I tend to find you can't really understand Titanic unless you understand her sister ships, Olympic and Britannic. And in turn, I found you can't understand them unless you kind of go back and study the history of the White Star Line. So yeah, I started off with a Titanic focus, and then I've broadened out.
Mm-hmm.
So find it quite a fascinating subject, really. I was one of those people. I think I got interested at school. We had a school project. I think it was called the Unsinkable Ship, and they were kind of describing all the watertight compartments, and uh, this this huge ship that was built, and then explain that it had sank on its first voyage. I think it was a year or two after that there was a book fair at school, and one of the books they were selling was Exploring the Titanic, which was I think it's basically the children's version of the Discovery of the Titanic book. So it was Robert Ballard, had all of the Ken Marshall paintings of the wreck, and then saw the film A Night to Remember. And I think it was only a few weeks later that the Cameron film was released. And then, of course, towards the end of the 90s, there was just Titanic mania, really. Everyone seemed to be interested. It were just hundreds of books, magazines, TV programs, and just went from there.
So obviously, my interest is centrally in Titanic, but that's also mostly because I don't really know. I'm not a historian, and this isn't what I know a lot about. So, I mean, obviously, I can't say, tell me the entire history of the White Star Line, but like, you're encountering someone like me who's familiar with the Titanic. What are some things that I should know about the sister ships or the history, either facts or stories that enhance the overall thing that just like most people don't know simply because it's not Titanic centric?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, I mean, White Star had a bit of a checkered history, really, because it was still a relatively young company in 1912. Um, so Thomas Ismay, who's J. Bruce Ismay's father, um, his company really got going in the early 1870s, and it could really have not lasted more than a year or so, because of course there was the tragic wreck of the White Star steamer Atlantic. I think it was 1873, I think it was, might have been 1872. And I suppose you could say that for the White Star Line, which was officially the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, it could have ended there, really. But White Star overcame misfortune, and over the course of decades, basically they took on British rivals such as Cunard, and to a large degree they beat them at their own game. They're an upstart company, and for years in the 1890s and the 1880s, White Star was largely prospering, whereas Cunard having quite a few years where they seemed to be in trouble and they needed to be raising money, or as it was at the start of the 20th century, Cunard basically had to go to the British government for state support. And arguably, without help from the British government, Lusitania and Mauritania could not have been financed, could not have been built. Cunard would probably have been taken over or gone bankrupt. And we might have seen the opposite, really, because, you might be aware that Cunard and White Star merged in the 1930s, but by that time it was Cunard that had the upper hand. So, we often hear about Titanic being built to kind of, take on Cunard, but also it was German lines they were competing against as well. But at that time, White Star was a pretty strong company, pretty successful company, and even the loss of the Titanic, the company survived it. You really need to understand White Star. You need to understand the relationship with Harland and Wolff, just to appreciate the context, really. Where Titanic came from, where her sister ships came from, and certainly I found that. I mean, I've researched Oceanic, which is called the ship of the century when she came out in 1899.
I don't know anything about the Oceanic.
Well, she was quite an impressive ship, really, and in terms of cost, I think, allowing for size, she was actually more expensive than Titanic was, but she was really a ship where she was built for speed, but she was not the fastest afloat. White Star had got to the point where they thought, well, we can't get the speed record, or didn't want to take the speed record from the Germans, and really she was sort of a step along the way, because she was built and they went for luxury, they went for comfort. She wasn't the fastest ship afloat, but she was pretty competitive. She was designed for 21 knots. And if you look at it in that sense, to a large degree, you can say maybe that the Olympic class ships were basically enlarged on that kind of concept, but in terms of size, a much greater scale. White Star were really doing this by themselves. They had to raise the money. It was a huge project at the time. There's a statistic I'm fond of quoting that Oceanic is believed to have cost about £750,000, which was a huge sum in 1899. But if you add up Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, their cost was more than 5 million. And White Star didn't have any state support. They had to raise the money themselves. It's one of those myths that won't go away. There's this myth that J.P. Morgan, financed these ships. He didn't, and the bank didn't. And really, for White Star, you can take some idea of just how big this project was. The entire White Star fleet in 1908 was valued at about £4.8 million. So there's I think it was 23 ships they had in the fleet at that point, and they're spending more on these three huge new ships than the entire value of the fleet. So it's just a huge undertaking, really. And of course, White Star didn't really ever get the commercial benefit, because there's the horrible human tragedy, the Titanic disaster, and of course Britannic was lost as a casualty of war, Loss of life didn't really compare, but nonetheless, 30 people
Yeah.
died. And yeah, I guess you could say it's really unrealized dreams in that sense, or the hand of fate. I guess whatever cliche you want to use.
What? How did they get the money? Because that's not a small amount of money. It's not like they needed $20. They needed vast cash.
They did. They did. I mean, most people's eyes sort of glaze over when you go into all the um, all the technicalities of it and all the sort of boring financial detail. But the short story is that White Star basically had to mortgage its existing fleet. So,
That sounds risky.
well, yes and no. I mean, if you've got security, then people are more willing to lend you money. Um, and White Star was a profitable company, so that they were able to take some of um, uh, the, the money, the resource from profits they were making. But basically, they borrowed the money, so they mortgaged their existing fleet as security, and they borrowed the money from largely British investors based in the United Kingdom. Because of course at this time, I mean, New York was rising, and the American economy, is really starting to boom. But London was still the world centre of finance at this time, and yeah, they borrowed the money. They didn't have any issues, and really there was a perception that shipping securities, that if you lent money to a shipping line, was seen as one of the more secure enterprises, and that was certainly Lord Pirrie's view. I mean, he's on record as certainly he felt that loaning money to shipping lines, buying shipping securities was among the most secure. And
It's like what
really,
everyone says about cryptocurrency today.
oh goodness, yeah. Well,
I know nothing about that, so I can't get down a rabbit hole with that, but it sounds like a similar argument where it's like nothing more secure. Nothing more
yeah.
secure than the blockchain. I'm like,
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about crypto blockchain. I mean, it'd be
those are
nice
the
if I
only
did.
words I know.
Yeah, you see these people on Instagram that are apparently billionaires because they've been mining crypto. I'm sure if I tried that, it wouldn't work.
Same.
But it was tricky because they had to pay for these ships before they were earning a pound or earning a dollar, earning a dime. Um, and they had to pay the shipbuilder because they were having to buy the materials, they were paying the laborers, they were building these ships, these huge costs, and of course they didn't even start earning it until after they'd been launched, after they'd been fitted out, and they'd made the maiden voyage. And of course, it was only Olympic that ever achieved that.
Yes.
So
And yet somehow we remember the middle child.
yes, yeah, it's kind of the triumph and disaster. I mean, Olympic and Titanic, they started life pretty much from the same blueprints.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, when Olympic made her maiden voyage, she was so successful. Um, straight away, White Star confirmed the order for the third sister ship. But of course, Titanic had just been launched,
Mm-hmm.
and they really set about making all sorts of changes just to make in first class at least, a fair bit more luxurious in terms of, the Café Parisien, the larger a la carte restaurant, the expanded suites, the suites with the private promenade decks, first to go to sea. So you can certainly say that Titanic was, in many ways, she was a copy of Olympic, but certainly improved. Um, I guess it's just that, that extraordinary um, bad luck, the nature of that tragedy. I mean, no one would have thought it likely that she would sink on her maiden voyage, that she would never get to New York. And
Why would you think that?
well, I mean, even if you think, well, the ship could sink, you would never imagine there was a loss of life. I
No.
mean, White Star's Republic had sunk about 3 years earlier, but she stayed afloat for something like 38 or 40 hours. They were just able to transfer people, lifeboats going back and forth to rescue ships. And, Titanic completely undid all of these complacent assumptions.
That is true.
Yeah.
It's interesting how when you research anything about the Titanic, whether it's the cultural history, the shipyard history, why people scream about the movie, like no matter what angle you're looking into, there's something new to learn at every corner. And I I feel as though it's not in a bad way, but that the human tragedy of what happened overshadowed the entire building process because it happened so quickly afterwards. It's sort of like I can't think of a good one. I mean, I brought up 9/11 so many times, but up until 9/11 happened, the Twin Towers were kind of looked at as sort of iconic landmarks. People would go visit them and take pictures, and you talked about them in this way, and no one was ever like, those towers are going to fall down one day. It wasn't the thought in your mind as you walked by, like, wonder when that's coming down. That's not how you lived your life here, and I'm moving around during a sentence. But it's not until after 9/11 happened that the human tragedy element overtook the grandeur of its history, which is not to say people still don't look at it, but it's now not the major part, is not what I want to say either. But that is what happened.
Yeah, yeah. They were overshadowed by the terrorist attack. It was a
Yeah.
disaster, but it was a terrorist attack.
Or like Hurricane Katrina, which was just an absolute disaster. That absolutely ruined a bunch of people. But it's the same sort of thing where it gets overtaken by, which is a good thing in one way because you learn about the people, you learn to be respectful of everything. But on the other hand, it does sort of erase everything that it was before.
Yeah, I mean, the name Titanic, it's just a byword for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's there's not been any other ship called the Titanic since, um, and she was fairly quickly, for understandable reasons, taken out of White Star's publicity material. Um, but yeah, I mean, you look at Olympic. I mean, she represented the same engineering accomplishment. Had quarter of a century of great success, carried hundreds of thousands of passengers, made money, created jobs for the crew, for the shipping line, and transported people in safety.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you've just got this remarkable thing where you've got a ship that's virtually a near identical twin,
Mm-hmm.
and through such a combination of circumstances, the disaster completely overshadows everything else. I mean, you think of the thousands of men, and really it was men, in Harland and Wolff shipyard,
Mm-hmm.
and you know the years of work, the sense of achievement, and this was grinding manual labour, um, and they put all that in, and the years of planning this ship, and it's just all taken away in a couple of seconds. Um,
Yeah.
and as Philip Franklin said in New York, well, they can replace the ship, they can't replace the approximately 1,500 lives
Yeah.
um, that, that were lost, and just the human tragedy. Um, in many ways, it was overtaken. I mean, you had the First World War,
Hmm.
or just the Great War, as it was known as at the time, because obviously there hadn't been a Second World War yet.
We have
Um,
news for the past.
yeah, yeah, you had the Spanish flu, well, the influenza, and the people that were killed. The economic crash. The 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 penury that people experienced in the 30s across much of the Western world. The devastation of the Second World War, the Cold War that followed, or the Korean War. Um, I mean, Titanic didn't really fade from consciousness, but people often say, well, it was really the release of A Night to Remember in the mid 50s. The book and then the film that kind of sort of re-established the disaster in popular consciousness. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not a cultural historian. I mean, I'm not sure. I dare say there's some research somewhere where you can pick out how many times the word Titanic is mentioned,
Probably.
in various journals. But and then of course the discovery of the wreck, and then
Hmm.
the Cameron film not that long afterwards,
Hmm.
relatively. Um, it's just something that seems to capture people's imagination, and whether it's the engineering aspects, whether it's the human tragedy, the kind of idea pride cometh before a fall.
Hmm.
Um, uh, yeah, because Olympic, she was a success. Titanic wasn't, and
Right.
you know, I'm sure 99.99% of people never heard of Olympic,
Yeah.
and probably not that many people necessarily think about the Queen Mary, or
I don't, to be
no,
perfectly fair.
if you even the most famous ocean liners, or Normandy, for example, in the 30s, people today, unless you're interested in the subject, haven't really heard of them. And to a large degree, Titanic is famous because of the disaster.
It,
That's not something you want to be famous for.
no, I mean, I think that, for example, if Titanic had sunk during her sea trials, when there wasn't 2,200 people on board, and it may have been more of an embarrassment than a tragedy. It would have been like, how the heck did that happen? Hopefully, if that were to happen, then there wouldn't be a loss of life. But it wouldn't it would be a thing where they were like, we have to keep this quiet. This has to be the quietest thing. Titanic was never built. We're going to build it later. We're going to build it later. It would have been a very different outcome, and it kind of might have been even funny in a way when some historian discovers it's like, wait, I'm sorry, that's what happened to the first Titanic? You sneezed? Great. And it would have been sort of not as interesting.
I think, well, yeah, I mean, not literally, of course, because
Mm-hmm.
she was such a feature of the Belfast skyline. But yeah, I completely. I think the human tragedy, the nature of um, the nature of the sinking, and she wasn't like there were other disasters. I mean, Lusitania as an example.
Mm-hmm.
She sank in less than 20 minutes.
Horrifying.
Um, and there's an irony there. I mean, in many ways, she was within sight of land. She was off the southern coast of Ireland, and it was an act of war. Um, and yet, she did have enough lifeboats for everyone, but there just wasn't the time. And she soon took on a list, so many of them became useless because the ship was leaning, um, to the starboard side, and the cold sea was still deadly, even though they were within sight of the coast, and it was day. But Titanic, there just seemed to be so many ironies. I mean, she sank in 2 hours 40 minutes. I mean, it wasn't long enough for help to arrive, um, and
They didn't have
but
helicopters that could just. There weren't airplanes. You couldn't send airborne rescue quickly.
no, no. But she was also she sank. She was relatively stable. She didn't take much of a list. They were able to launch lifeboats from both sides of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was one of the arguments at the time. People were arguing, well, if we have lifeboats for everyone, you might not be able to use half of them anyway. That was certainly the view of Cunard's naval architect.
Didn't the Lusitania sink without launching a single lifeboat just because they simply did not have the time?
I
Or am I
believe
mixing up wrecks?
I'm not really a Lusitania researcher. I believe they were able to launch a few.
Okay, there is a wreck I'm
It's
thinking
only
of.
a few.
There is a wreck somewhere in this world that I am thinking of that I can't remember the name of, but it sunk so quickly that they simply were not able to launch any lifeboats. To
Yeah,
where it really depends. Titanic had about 3 hours. You can, even if everyone was the slowest sailor on board, you'd still be able to get a few of them offhand. But if you hit something really, really bad and go down in, say, 30 minutes, you might not be able to get one of those things even ready to go.
no. And there are some ships, of course, which over the years have just vanished without trace. So
Horrifying, by the way. That is a horrifying concept that a plane, a ship, a thing full of people is. Whoosh, I
yeah,
hate it.
yeah, and we see it wasn't that many years ago. I think it was within 10 years that was it. A Malaysian Airlines, forget the number of it, but a flight
Yep,
basically
exactly.
vanished. It never arrived in Beijing, and you just think, well, how on earth can that happen with a modern aircraft and with all the gadgetry?
That was Malaysia Flight 370. Sorry, I
Yeah,
used Google.
yeah, that's the one. That's the one. And you just start to think, well, after a couple of hours, well, they'll find something. Um, I mean, with Titanic, I mean, if she hadn't been able to call for help, she was due in New York within a couple of days, so there'd certainly have been alarm bells sounded. Um, and the wireless operators, the Marconi operators, Bride and Phillips, there had been some trouble with the Marconi equipment earlier in the
Right.
voyage, and they'd sort of stepped in. I believe they weren't actually meant to. I think it was Park Stevenson that said, I think they went against guidelines, but they
Yeah,
basically
they weren't supposed.
the
It's sort of
equipment.
like there's certain companies now where if you tinker with your thing and you're not an insert brand professional, it voids the warranty. I don't
Yeah,
know if it was a warranty thing necessarily, but yeah, they were not supposed to be tinkering with that, but they were just like, you're taking too long. There is a backlog beyond our ears, and they just figured it out.
yeah, and you just think, well, can you imagine if that had been the case, and the wireless hadn't been working and they hadn't been able to call for help. I
Yeah.
mean, with a ship
Also
like
horrifying.
Titanic, you would think that if she had gone down with everyone on board, that they would have recovered some debris. But I don't know about Waratah. I'm not sure if any. I don't believe any trace was found. I might be mistaken. I mean, White Star had lost a small ship, uh, Neronic, I think it was, early 1890s, and it's a complete mystery what happened to that, because she wasn't equipped with wireless. Um, believe a message in a bottle was found. Not sure how genuine that was. Um, but they held an inquiry, and they looked at the ship and thought, well, she was well built. A surveyor said, well, she was seaworthy. She passed with flying colours. She was well designed. They
Mm-hmm.
just couldn't work out what could have happened to her. And to this day, we've no idea.
I just looked it up, and also, again, absolutely insane. Where it's just like, what? I know that there are forces in this world that we don't know about. There's creatures at the bottom of the ocean that we just haven't gotten deep enough to find, and I am sure that there are some cases where it's like you're literally in the middle of nowhere. You hit something in a freak accident, you go down in 30 minutes, and it's just there's nothing left except for the bubbles.
Yeah.
And, I can completely see that. But with something so big, you're like, there wasn't even a hand towel left behind? Are you kidding me? No teacups? Are you joking? Are
Yeah.
you joking?
Yeah.
Nothing?
I mean, it is quite interesting. It was a couple of weeks after the disaster, collapsible A was found floating by Oceanic, and she was on the same service, Southampton to New York, and they run across the boat, so maybe something similar would have happened. There were newspaper reports that the people on collapsible A had starved to death. Which is
Maybe.
something horrible to think of. I mean, they hadn't. They had unfortunately not survived beyond that morning, and therefore
Yeah.
Carpathia, they left the boat adrift. So
Yeah.
there was no truth in that story, but there were newspapers that said, they found people from Titanic that had starved to death, and that's wasn't the case, and
Right.
people, it soon was clarified, they haven't starved to death, but the initial newspaper reports are still sometimes quoted. But if she couldn't call for help,
Yeah.
imagine they'd lowered the lifeboats, but then that horrendous thing that no one comes to their rescue, and long exposure at sea. I mean, it'd just be a horrible. But I dare say some of the lifeboats would have been found at some point,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
I very much doubt people would have lasted. Because you got 60 people in a lifeboat, or
Hmm.
however many people it might be. I mean, it was typically less than that. But not having supplies, not having water, completely exposed to the elements.
Hmm.
Storm was starting to get up that morning. It just doesn't. As horrible as it was, it could have been so
Yeah.
much worse.
I know that, again, I don't know the names of any of the ships, but I think there was some testimony from people who were on board ships that passed nearby or through the debris field that in the next few days would just look over and see bodies.
I believe. I think there are reports. I'm not sure if one of them was Bremen. It was a German liner. I mean, not something I've read for ages. But of course, they did find, quite a number of the people, that all the rescue
Hmm.
efforts. They tried to recover victims for burial. You
That
know,
was the whole purpose of sending out the Mackie Bennett.
yeah,
Or is it the Mackay Bennett? I don't know how to say it.
I'm not sure. I think people tend to hear people say Mackay Bennett, um, but they did recover. I'm not sure how many it was. I think it was about 300. Um,
Not sure. A vast majority of them were given sea burials.
yeah, so it's just the horror of it, really, and that for if you just imagine that there had been enough lifeboats and that they'd been able to launch them. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, it would have needed more trained crew as well, and
Right.
more boats on their own are not enough. Um, but it's one of those cases where people could have survived, and there are so many what ifs with Titanic.
Hmm.
what if the collision had happened slightly differently, or just one less compartment, and she would
Yeah.
have been able to remain afloat. Um, there are the track she was on. There were basically agreed northern and southern routes.
Mm-hmm.
For the shipping lines, and several years prior, the agreed routes had actually been moved south because of reports of ice,
Mm-hmm.
and reports were coming in as Titanic was leaving Ireland, and you just think, well, maybe if she'd sailed a week or so later,
Yeah.
Perhaps they'd have moved the track like they'd done in earlier years,
Right.
and um, maybe she wouldn't have encountered ice. Well, certainly not where she did, because she'd been
Right.
sailing further south.
I what after the sinking of Titanic, how did this affect the city of Belfast, where the shipyard was built? Because that was they were a shipbuilding town. That's what you did in Belfast. You built ships, and I'm sure that there was a lot not riding on it, and that everyone was holding their breath, but they were like, oh yeah, Titanic's going to make a voyage, it's going to continue making money, so continue building this one. There was a whole lot of and then, and then those didn't come to pass.
Yeah, well, I think it was around 1900. I think Lady Pirrie, um, well, she wasn't lady then. I think Pirrie became a lord 1906 or 7. Um, but she'd said, I think about 1 in 8 jobs in Belfast she thought were dependent in some way on the shipyard.
Yeah.
Whether that's people working in the shipyard itself, or whether it's supply companies, or that sort of thing. And there are other shipbuilders, Workman Clark and so on. I mean, for Harland and Wolff, there were Harland and Wolff workers on the maiden voyage, the Guarantee Group. Of course, most famously Thomas Andrews, who lost his life. And there was a huge impact on the company. His loss was felt very keenly. And
He was the chief designer for everything.
well, yeah, I mean, in popular history, he tends to be called Titanic's designer. I mean,
I'm sure he was one of several, but
yeah,
principal.
he was one of a team. I mean, Alexander Carlisle, who retired in 1910, was more senior at that time and really leading on the project. So when Andrews took over Carlisle's duties, I mean, to a large degree, he was taking over a project where the major decisions had already been taken. But yeah, Andrews was very highly regarded. He lost his life. Of course, there's the
Yeah.
family connection. He was Lord Pirrie's nephew.
I will say that all historical accounts that I can find say that Andrews was a pretty stand-up guy.
He was certainly very highly regarded. You don't really find anyone with a bad word to say about him.
A rarity, really.
Well, I don't. I think there's the tragedy. It's someone that's gone before their time. Um, I mean, he wasn't yet 40. I think he was 38, 39 at the time of Titanic's maiden voyage.
Right.
And yeah, he was certainly highly regarded. I mean, the comments on his work ethic. He'd be in the shipyard early,
Mm-hmm.
4 a.m. or 5 a.m. or something, he was really putting the hours in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was basically, although there was the family connection, it was widely said that he wasn't given any special treatment. He had to work his way up.
That's good.
But he certainly seems to have been someone with an aptitude, with a skill.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sorry,
and
I
yeah,
completely
someone.
detracted that from Belfast.
Yeah, it's just someone with a regard for the workers. I mean, Violet Jessup, she was a stewardess on Olympic, and
Hmm.
she commented on some of the features of the ship that Andrews had implemented, to make people's lives a bit easier. Um, I mean, one of the things we get an insight into Andrews from the notes he made on Olympic's maiden voyage the year before.
Right, right.
And I'm sure he was making similar notes on Titanic, which of course haven't survived. But um, one of the things he recommended was that the third class staterooms or cabins be fitted with slip bolts from the inside, so that the cabin occupants could put the bolt across and secure themselves.
Hmm.
And what was in his mind, he was basically saying that, this is partly for protecting the occupants of these cabins, especially those occupied by women,
Hmm.
um, because the sad reality at this time, um, in third class in particular, and whether you were traveling as a group or whether you were an unaccompanied female immigrant, um, sadly there was a reality that sexual assault, um, don't quite know how common it was, but it certainly wasn't uncommon.
Hmm.
um, the lines tried to keep, the firemen, their quarters were in a separate part of the ship. Third class male passengers tended to be berthed towards the bow,
Hmm.
whereas single women and family groups were towards the stern. Um, but that's just a bit of an insight into, his his approach. He said, we if we put these slip bolts on, then they'll be able to bolt the cabin from the inside.
Hmm.
Um, so you won't have a situation where it might be at night and people are sleeping, and someone might be able to get in.
Hmm.
um, and some of the other recommendations he's got, they're in large part for just the efficient working of the ship.
Sure.
But there is that degree of saying, well, actually it'll be more comfortable for the crew, for the passengers. um, Although there's obviously a commercial element to it as well. I mean, you want
Right.
passengers to have a good experience on the ship.
Yeah,
um,
they'll leave you a 5-star review that way.
well, yeah, I mean, you know they they really were pretty well treated compared to many of the ships that were at sea at
Right.
the time. Third class, you had these open dormitories. People, um, it, were just sleeping in these huge dormitories, loads of people. You don't not necessarily that well ventilated. Some of the ships that were crossing at the turn of the century were really not fit for
Right.
for humans. And the U.S. government. I mean, there was an agent of the authorities. She actually crossed on a number of passenger steamers from, I think, mostly from Germany. I think there were British
Hmm.
ships as well. And she travelled on an earlier White Star ship, Cedric, in 1909. And this was a time where just having your own stateroom, having a porthole, wow, you can see out. You've got light, ventilation. Having a call bell, or to get a steward's attention,
What
was
a
just
concept.
pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to Belfast. I mean, it was certainly, you know, I think it was described as eerie. At Harland and Wolff, when the news came through. I mean, I don't think Harland and Wolff, they remained a successful shipyard.
Hmm.
And it was a relatively small number of people from Harland and Wolff who were lost on the ship. I mean, not that that's any consolation, of course, but
Right.
You look at somewhere like Southampton and the
Yeah.
amount of crew that were from Southampton. Um, and newspapers of the time, they tried to illustrate it. There was a photo, I forget the name of the street, but there was this photo and it had been annotated. I think it might have been the Southampton Pictorial,
Hmm.
and it had a sort of label on the different houses, and it said things like Mrs. So and so, she lost her husband,
Mm.
and the next one, so and so lost their brother. There's a house, father and son were on Titanic,
Yeah.
and you've got house after house where it's just labelled. Um, I think it was called a city of sorrow.
Mm.
In one of the reports of the time, it was just a horrible. And people were on edge for months afterwards. I mean, there was a rumor. It was around September or August 1912, I think, and somehow there was a rumor going round that Olympic had sunk, and anxious crowds started to gather outside the White Star offices, because they were worried there was some truth in it, and what with Titanic,
Yeah.
sinking some months earlier, rumors like that in previous years would have just been shrugged off.
Hmm.
They're all too believable.
Well,
So
yeah. Once the impossible happens, you have to start entertaining every other impossible angle.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, at this time, there wasn't provision like we've got today in terms of social security or benefits. Um, so not just losing relatives, but you lose a loved one, and there's that huge economic burden as well.
Right.
Um, yeah, it's just horrible to think about, and this had a lasting impact. I mean, there were efforts like the relief fund to try and provide for people, provide for dependents, but
Hmm.
um, it went on for some years. And, that's often overlooked,
Hmm.
because we tend to focus on the immediate disaster, but not
Hmm.
the aftermath, the
And
months
there's a
and
lot.
years afterwards where Southampton was affected, people were affected.
Hmm. There, there is a lot of emphasis put on the immediacy, but you're right in that it did have quite a lasting effect. In even aside from the victims themselves, there's, as you pointed out, all those people that lost family, people who lost, entire generations, wiped out because they had both their children were working on Titanic, or excuse me. But there was so much that went after for people who needed to try to get back on their feet. Like a lot of the women who were left widows, many of them had probably not worked. Not all. There were some that definitely had, but there was some that would suddenly need to, or suddenly you have to work two jobs instead of one because you have to take care of children that you weren't counting on.
And, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there were. I mean, I don't know if it's something that's been done already, but I'm sure there are probably some sort of people-focused researchers or people that have researched into the relief fund that probably got some good examples of that. Um, and
Probably.
yeah, it was just a whole other time. It was a whole other
Hmm.
time, and the word charitable contributions, but they only go so far. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it was Mauritania. She'd left Ireland. I think it was the 14th of April,
Hmm.
and when news of the disaster came through, she was still on the way to New York,
Hmm.
and believed the passengers held a collection.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean that must have been a nervous crossing because they were heading pretty much the same way and they knew about this ice. So
I think everyone
Mauritania's
was just
shipping,
I picture everyone just standing on the railing every day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Mauritania's captain, he certainly took every precaution. I believe she steered south.
Smart.
Certainly the shipping routes were moved south in the
Hmm.
aftermath of the disaster.
I can understand why. Seems like the safest thing to do, especially
Yeah,
given everything.
yeah. Um, but the odds of it happening, I mean, it just comes back to the impossible, or it's not the impossible, it's the inconceivable.
The improbable, yeah.
Yeah, because you look at the statistics for how safe it was. Certainly in terms of British ships on the North Atlantic route. So this is for eastern ports in the United States, Canadian or North American ports. They tend to be classed sometimes as the same, um, but the number of people that had sailed, you know, and compared to the loss of life, I mean, I believe the numbers were in the millions, and
Yeah.
people that sailed successfully, and then you know it was just seen as a safe mode of travel, and that just completely came to an end. Um,
I can see how that would shatter your illusion, but I think maybe now it's just a little not easier, just because we all know driving a car is super risky. We're all aware that airplanes crash. It happens. We everything that like I live in near DC, so we have the metro system. I'm like, how often does a car derail? Like, there's always something happening to where, yes, the dog has come over.
oh, isn't it nice? See the tail
Yeah.
wagging. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just short enough where you can't see him in the webcam, but you can every once in a while see a little flag tail going by. Um, yeah, it's just we're far more aware of the risks of things now, but yeah, I think this goes back to that whole hubris that was associated with Titanic, where it was just like, no, that can't happen. Why would it happen? But now I think we're very aware of like, yes, sinkholes are scary. We should be on the lookout for those.
Yeah, I mean, there was something sort of in the aftermath. I mean, Captain Smith, you know, he's the captain. He's ultimately responsible for the ship,
Right.
but it, it tended to be couched in terms of, well, he was doing what other skilled people would have done in the same position.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a practice that's grown up over time. Whether it's passengers expecting a ship to keep to the schedule,
Hmm.
to arrive on time. Um, this notion that actually if we do encounter ice, we'll be able to see it and we'll be
Yes.
able to avoid it, and there won't be a problem. Um,
It won't happen to us.
no, but that there have been incidents in the years before.
Hmm.
Um, was one of the German liners, I think it was 1907. I think it might have been the Kronprinz Wilhelm. Um, it was one of the North German Lloyd ships, but she collided with an iceberg, survived.
Hmm.
But and actually in 1913 there was a White Star ship, Teutonic,
Hmm.
and she encountered an iceberg and managed to avoid it. Um, I mean, again with Titanic, it's just one of those if onlys. I mean,
Yeah.
personally, I think that First Officer Murdoch, who of course was on the bridge,
Hmm.
he was the officer of the watch when the
Yes.
iceberg was sighted. I mean, I think he came close to pulling off a miracle.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, of course, close isn't good enough when you end up striking the ice and there's a disaster of such magnitude.
Sure.
Um, but I do think he does get a bit of a raw deal in history. I mean, my opinion, and this is nothing scientific at all, but I do get the impression that if anyone could have avoided the iceberg, it would have been Murdoch. And if he couldn't, I doubt that Lightoller or anyone else on duty could have done
Yeah.
either.
Murdoch was a very capable, very knowledgeable, extremely dedicated seaman.
Yeah,
This wasn't his first voyage, and he wasn't some idiot. This was, I think that Dan Parks might makes the argument that he might even be the most qualified. He and Wilde may have been two of the most qualified people on board to be on a big ship.
yeah. Well, if you look at officers with experience on Olympic, um, among Titanic's officers, well, Lightoller, second
Mm-hmm.
officer Lightoller, third officer Pitman, fourth officer Boxall, fifth officer Lowe, sixth officer Moody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, None of them had served on Olympic.
Yeah.
So a ship like Titanic was very much new to them.
Mm-hmm.
Captain Smith, he'd commanded Olympic on every voyage.
Yep.
I believe Murdoch, certainly Chief Officer Wilde, he hadn't been on every Olympic voyage. He
Mm-hmm.
took over, I think, on the second voyage. And I believe Murdoch may have missed one of Olympic's voyages, but certainly nearly all of them he'd
Yeah.
served on Olympic. Murdoch had, and Wilde as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Murdoch, he just comes across as an officer who was very capable. He'd been first officer on Oceanic for quite a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, I think the issue really was, not everyone can be a captain because
Yeah.
there simply aren't enough ships.
Right. 23 ships at White Star Line. That's a maximum. If every ship gets its own captain at the same time, there's a maximum of 23 captains.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes look at it, and the officers on Titanic. As it's sometimes said, well, the officers that survived, so Lightoller down, well, Sixth Officer Moody, of course, he unfortunately lost his life.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes said, well, none of them ever had their own command. But then if you look at the equivalent officers on Olympic's maiden voyage,
Mm-hmm.
only the officer equivalent to Lightoller on Titanic, well, perhaps senior, he only got his permanent command in the late 20s.
There's
So
just a finite number of slots.
Sorry,
All I said is there's just a finite number of slots.
Yeah, exactly. But Smith had been commander for quite a number of years,
Mm-hmm.
and you sometimes wonder. I'm not saying there was, but you sometimes wonder if younger officers, resented some of the longer-serving captains, because it's almost like, well, I want to be promoted, and some of the veterans are perhaps blocking.
That's currently what's happening right now in the job market and in at least the American political system, where we're like, could you just get out of the way?
Yeah.
Thank you. You're 87.
Yeah. Well, and I've certainly noticed. I don't want to stray into US politics, but I've certainly noticed. Yeah, you see people that are, of an age.
Listen, the Grim Reaper just needs to hang out in Congress long enough, and he'll get somebody real quick.
Well,
Doesn't even need to do anything.
Just think it's good to have a balance of age. You need, experience is great, but you need young blood as well.
You do, and there's a lot of people who think that Smith was too old, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, I'm a bit of a Murdoch stan, so I will always jump in and defend him. But I also defend the lookouts because everyone was doing the best that they could. Like if you get a friend or your significant other, find a room in your house that has no light, tell them to put a glass of ice water in there, blindfold you, sit down, take off the blindfold, and I want you to find that glass. It's going to be really hard, even though the space is limited, because seeing in the dark is exceptionally difficult. And I mean, I know I'm saying obvious stuff, but like, listen, I don't think I could have seen an iceberg in pitch blackness until it was in a reasonable distance for it to literally just loom into my horizon. That's hard. I mean, seriously, if you just go into your bathroom or your closet, close the door and turn off the lights, try to find your favorite shirt and put it on. I want to see this. And you might get lucky. It might go well. You might just remember where it is. But especially if it's something like an iceberg,
yeah. Well, I mean, and you know, it's also you're staring into the wind as well, because I mean the speed of the ship is doing about 22.5 knots, maybe a bit more
in the cold.
And, you know, you've got that wind against you, looking into it.
It's freezing outside.
Freezing, yeah. I mean, you know, these are not great conditions. Being a lookout is a pretty boring job. And you know, someone like Fred Fleet, I think it could have been any lookout on duty that just happened to have the misfortune of being on duty when it happened. And you know, in later years, you know, Fleet was, I think he was 24 or 25 in 1912. He was
young. He was a young guy.
He was a young man. Although, you know, you see photos of him, he looks older than his years. He certainly looks older than what we think of today as a 24, 25-year-old.
So I love watching pictures of teenagers from like the 80s. They all look like they're in their late 30s.
Yeah.
Just the way people dressed and styled, and
yeah,
it was a harder life too.
I suppose so. Yeah. Well, yeah, harder life in those days. But Fleet, you know, in later years, he earned some money as a newspaper seller. You know, there's some. I think there's a photo. It might be in Titanic Voices where it's got a picture of him. You know, can't really recognise him. Of course, he's so much older. He's wearing glasses by that point, but he's you know, he was still in Southampton, and he sold papers or what have you. And you know, I forget where I read it, but there was some anecdote. You'd sometimes get local kids, you know, sort of shouting out to him something about, you know, there's an iceberg, or could you see it? And there was some controversy some years back. I think it was the centennial. Someone put some binoculars on his grave in Southampton, and there was a note or something which said, you know, if only you'd had these.
Yeah, don't do that. That's not funny.
Well, I mean, that it's a whole other debate, to be honest. I mean,
right.
You know, there's the argument about binoculars, and actually they wouldn't necessarily have helped. But
yeah, I talk about that a bit. Again, go in a pitch black room, see if those binoculars help you at all.
Well, they certainly restrict your vision.
That's and again, it is dark outside.
Yeah, but yeah. But then Fleet and Lee, you know, both lookouts survived, and you know, you look at the statistics, the majority of the crew didn't.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that they both managed to.
Yeah, and Fleet, I think it was in one of the early lifeboats. I think it was Lifeboat 6. It was one of the first launched on the port side. I believe Lee was in 13 or 15. I can't remember. But yeah, you know, imagine being in that position, because you know they reported what they saw.
No
reason to think they weren't doing their job
Right. They didn't conjure the iceberg that I'm aware of.
No,
If they
it's
did,
just
we could have a very different discussion.
yeah, yeah. Um,
I don't know. There's
it's
so
just
much.
reality that you just think they were running, and Smith was running a much greater risk
Yeah,
than was appreciated. Um,
there's a lot.
and you think, well, just because the disaster hasn't happened to date doesn't mean it can't happen.
Exactly. But I think I've taken a lot of your time, and I don't want to take the rest of your evening. But I learned a lot. I admit that I don't know as much about like the sort of the establishing history of the White Star Line and Titanic, and I should. So I will probably be reaching out to you again at some point to be like, tell me more things. But
Yeah, it'd be
um,
great. Be glad to.
yeah,
If people are interested, I mean, I
yeah,
can
I am.
talk for ages, and I need some coffee.
That's fine. Later, that is what you get. Ugh, I moved my chair 1 inch. She was sitting directly behind it, and I was looking at me like it's mad. But sorry. But thank you so much for coming on. This was wildly informative.
Oh, thank you. It's been great to talk, and I never listen to my own recordings, whether it's lectures or
Fair.
podcasts or whatever. But I'll stay tuned for other people's.
Sweet.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. You are way smarter than I deserve, to be perfectly honest. And if you think so and want to get in touch with him, you totally should. You can find Mark on Twitter. Mark on Twitter. His username is Mark_Chirnside, MarkChirnside. You can also find him on Facebook, markchirnside.author, and you can find his website at markchirnside.co.uk. And speaking of finding people, you can find me, the show, on all the socials: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I technically have TikTok, but I've uploaded one thing to it, and I've opened it like twice. But it's all the same username. It's Titanic Talkline, all one word. And if you want to get in touch with me, which you should totally want to get in touch with me, you should email me at titanictalkline@gmail.com. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!